Thanks for joining us today, Doug.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Lynn Marie.
I mean, this was so rapid. Like I asked Doug to be on, and then he was like, "Yes," and then we were on the podcast. Or I asked Doug February 2018 to be on the podcast.
Yes, and it was not a lack of desire. It was a lack of making sure I fit in time for this most important subject. So I appreciate your patience with me.
You were too funny. Doug and I had a chat before this where we came up with all different characterizations by why it took a year. He's like, I wanted to make sure you had a year's worth of interviewing under your belt and that I was ready for this momentous interview. which
Indeed.
would be fair enough if that were your actual reason.
Definitely not, but I'm ready no matter what the whatever funny excuse I had beforehand. I'm ready now.
I love it. Doug and I met at something called Unrig the System, which I think will have probably already happened by the time this podcast comes out. I think it's this month again. Are you going?
Might
You're
have
not
been
going.
might have been last was it last week or no? I lost track of when it was, but it's too bad because it's going to be in Nashville. But
Yeah,
um,
it's an election reform conference, and before the conference, there was this meeting of what was kind of a veritable who's who in election reform, except for the fact that somehow I had snuck into this meeting, and I knew most of the people in the room, and the people I didn't know weren't necessarily speaking up. And then out of nowhere stands this tall, sharp dressed guy who just knew everything seemingly about election reform and what we needed to do. And I was like, who is this guy? Where did he come from? And he came from somehow Major League Baseball, which I did not see coming at the time. But as we spent more time together at the Unrig conference, I learned Doug's story. And in the intro, I will have certainly mentioned that you came from the world of baseball pitching and then ended up in the election reform world and now are on to other worlds. But I have had a specific request from a professional volleyball player to have a professional athlete who quit professional athletics on the show. And I said, I will recall my friend Doug and see if he's up for it. And thank you very much for coming on and sharing your story. So now let's get into it. And we just discussed, like many of the guests I have on, this conversation may be the first time you've thought back about a quit that was years ago. And so there may be new insights or things that you've learned or that pop up. So I'm very interested to hear your story. So if you could take us back, tell us a little bit about your baseball career and then what kind of feelings or symptoms or experiences led you to realize maybe it was time to leave.
sure. Um, well, it's funny because quitting, as somebody who grew up fairly driven, both academically and athletically, quitting was, or quit was the ultimate four-letter word. And for a variety of reasons, quitting was proverbially not an option. And so when I went to college, I'd always been a pretty good athlete. My favorite sport in high school was basketball, but my skill set lent me towards things that didn't have me jumping and dribbling as much. So I was playing baseball and I pitched, and so I went to the University of California, Berkeley, and was essentially not a very good player. I worked very hard, as hard as anybody, because I wasn't a quitter. And by my senior year, I remember I went into my coach's office and I told him, I didn't ask. I told him that my goal was to get drafted to play professionally. And bless his heart, he stifled the laugh and he said, "Well, I'll do whatever I can do to help you." And I said, "Look, I'm not asking for help. I'm just stating my intention." And so that year, I did. I had a better season than I had had in any of my previous seasons, and caught the eye of a scout. Went through the Major League Scouting Bureau and was drafted in the 13th round by the Anaheim Angels. So it was a big deal. I mean, obviously a childhood dream to be able to play professional baseball. I was absolutely terrible my first year. My professional debut was an unmitigated disaster. And then the rest of the season, having not endeared myself to my first professional manager, I somehow was able to go to a league after where it's an effort to hone you a little bit more. And in this case, it was to see if I had any ability in there. So I could have quit at that point because it just, it was a grind and it was a challenge, minor league travel on the bus and so on and so forth. But I just made a decision. I said, look, if I'm not going to quit. I'm going to see this through, and I know that I can get more out of myself. So I did, and I had a bit of an epiphany during that hot August, excuse me, hot. I guess it was a September and October down in Arizona, and put some things together. And then the next few years really took off in my professional career. So I ended up getting traded a couple years later to the Philadelphia Phillies, with whom I made my major league debut in 2000. And fantastic experience, as you can imagine, really exciting, fulfillment of a dream, and kind of one of those, I've made it. And that said, so I played for a couple years, up and down, minor leagues, AAA, back to the big leagues. And so it was very much a grind. It was very political. I also played during the most egregious era of steroid abuse. So I was competing against a lot of guys who were cheating, but it wasn't technically cheating, because at the time, if you were on what was known as the 40-man roster, you weren't tested for these types of things. And that's why, a lot of these guys who we know of now were using steroids were able to do it. So in any event, I had a phenomenal time. I played with, for, and against guys whose baseball cards I collected as a kid. So it was really an interesting journey, a lot of fun, made a lot of friendships. But I always had a little bit of a nagging, something in the back of my mind, that I wasn't just a baseball player, but it required, all of my time, or at least I thought it required all of my time and focus. So in playing a sport like that, and then having some feelings or second guessing that there were other things that I wanted to do, I would say those hit probably after I'd been in the big leagues for after my first year. September 11th, 2001 happened. And that really was a gut check for everybody in this country, but it was a gut check for me, because I thought, man, is there something else that I could or should be doing at this time?
Okay, he's like, all right, okay, now you've got us in suspense. So at that point, like you said, the entire nation is kind of reevaluating our purpose and our passions and our values, and you're at this place where you have accomplished your childhood dream, essentially.
Yep.
But you could continue with it, or you feel as like, okay, maybe there's this other side to me. Now, I'm guessing, again, I've never been anything near a professional athlete, but if there's something, okay, maybe I'm not just a baseball player, is the thought that goes through your head, okay, I'll take baseball just until they kick me out, until I'm just beyond the ability to play, and then I'll get to whatever there is besides baseball that's in me? Or was your more of a thing like, I don't want to wait until that point, I have this other desire to do this separate thing now?
I think for a lot of people, I personally played with people who said they're going to have to pull this uniform off me to get me to stop playing professional sport, even if it meant being in the minor leagues, riding on the buses, whatever. And I could have kept doing it. Both, I had accomplished everything I could have accomplished in AAA. The big leagues, it's all about, I sat there one time with Scott Rowland, potential future Hall of Famer. He's a teammate with the Phillies. And he said, the thing that I realized about getting to the big leagues, Doug, was it wasn't about getting to the big leagues. It was about staying there. And so that was, for me, again, as somebody who's very competitive, that resonated with me. So I went through these emotions of like, well, wait a minute here. I did it, but did I really do it? I was putting conditions on what success meant for me at that point. All the while, one of the challenges at the time was my mother had been battling breast cancer. She had breast cancer when I was a kid, and after 15 years, it came back, and it had metastasized into bone cancer and just a variety of other, the ugly story of cancer. And so here I am, kind of going through this semi-existential, journey for myself, because I was doing something that so many people loved, so many people revered, and I revered it and respected what I was doing, but I didn't think it was the most important thing anymore. One of the challenges for me as I was trying to figure this out is it wasn't anymore just about me, because my mom, who did everything for everybody, The only time she'd ever take time for herself, even when she was riddled by cancer and chemotherapy, was the hours on the East Coast when I was playing baseball, from about 4 till 7 Pacific time. She would lay down on the couch, wouldn't answer the phone, wouldn't get up, didn't feel the need to do anything for anybody. And I knew she was using me as a beloved excuse to try to, just take it easy, because that wasn't something she ever did. And so here I am entertaining, well, maybe I'll just stop playing baseball. And then I'm thinking, yeah, and then what's my mom going to be dealing with? She's going to have to not be relaxing on the couch watching me play. And so she ended up, when we were in, oops, can you still see me?
I can.
Okay. We were in Atlanta playing against the Braves for the National League East pennant when September 11th, 2001 hit. She had actually made the trip to come out and see us play. And it was really the last trip she could make while she was battling cancer. She never got to see me play in Atlanta because September 11th had happened. And it wasn't until a couple weeks later when we were in San Francisco where she got to watch me pitch against her favorite team, the Giants, on her birthday. Aww. And so she ended up passing away 3 weeks later, I think. And so here it was almost like now, after going through everything I had gone through, also thinking that I needed to play for her, I was like, man, is this the moment that frees me up? And then I realized I didn't need to be freed up for any other reason other than that I just needed to know what was my truth and what it was that I wanted to pursue. And at that point, it was very difficult for my dad because I was living his dream, as a professional athlete. He had played in college, and so he was living vicariously through me. So then there was the added disappointment of him losing his wife of 40 plus years. And then all of a sudden, here's me ultimately making the decision not to play baseball anymore. So wow. I had the weight of it felt like the weight of the world on my shoulders, but I also knew it was something I had to do for myself. And so making the decision was a big challenge, but I didn't want somebody to make the decision for me. And that's kind of what it came down to, because I had to live with the consequences and the opportunities of being able to move on from something like that. And it was the start of a whole other set of challenges when I did, but it was the right move.
I love that. There's almost nothing to ask you about because Doug is apparently a pro at strategic quitting, because you knew all of the things that would have probably halted other people at some point. Like, okay, I've got pressure from my father. I have pressure from every single person who's telling me, why would you leave your dream job? And, and I'm still qualified to play. It's not like they're ripping the uniform off of you. And yet you knew, you had already decided your values and your purpose were more important. And then you didn't need anybody's permission to quit. Is that just something you innately had, or are there lessons you learned along the way? Or how did you come up with that fortitude at that age?
I don't know if it didn't feel like fortitude at the time. It felt like a necessity. And I wish I could have called you then and had you help me work through it, because it probably would have been easier. I mean, like I said, it was a challenge for my dad, and again, because for my dad here, it was like 2 losses for him, because he had also had such high hopes and he had been there for every step of the way and had seen me doing so well. But dealing also with the political part of the game, where in my role, because I was taught, you do whatever the team needs, whatever the coach needs. And at the time, unfortunately, baseball was, in too many cases, was rewarding people who were selfish. And so here I was sort of the guy who was like, you need me to start, I'll start. You need me to be a closer, I'll close. Anything in between. And what that kind of made me, it sort of pigeonholed me in the too many roles, as opposed to putting me in one role. And so my dad having seen all that stuff, he's like, just stick with it. And it was, I think you've seen it, clearly you've seen it, and people that you work with all the time. A lot of us, when we get to that point of quitting, it's not a choice. It's a soulful mandate. And that's what I felt at the time. And it was, and I look back over the years. In fact, probably about 5 years after I quit, when I was still very physically capable of playing, I entertained the thought of going back, but every time I thought about it, even if I got to the point of training again, I always got to that point was you left for a reason. And I didn't have to know what the reason was. At the time I thought I did, and that made it hard for me. I didn't know what the reason was, but more importantly, I felt that there was a reason. Um, and that kind of freed me up to pursue some other things. I oftentimes, I think of your story and how much, you said you quit, and I know I have, but it's quitting is different than choosing, in my opinion, than choosing something else. And I felt like at times I've had occupational ADD because I'm so excited by a lot of things. I'm enthused by a lot of things. I like working with different people. I love learning new things. And I felt like, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't have to know all of those things right now, but in any event, that was something that had helped. But at the time, it didn't feel like fortitude. It felt like, oh man, everywhere I went, people are wondering, well, why'd you quit? And it pissed me off. I was like, I didn't quit. I chose to leave. And so I had to work through that emotion too, because it always felt like then people were challenging me, and they probably weren't. They were just asking questions, but I was still very competitive. So.
Understandable. So, how did you have that conversation with your father? And did he end up coming around to understanding your reason or the reason you thought you had at the time for leaving?
Yeah, he knew before my mom died that I was thinking about it, and he thought I was an idiot. Um, it took him probably 2 years until after I retired when he finally. I remember him. He was standing in the kitchen at his house, and I was in the living room, and he said, I'm really sorry. I get it now. I get it now. And he said, man, it wasn't fair of me to want you to keep doing what you were doing for me, even though that's not what I thought I was doing. I wanted you to succeed. As my son, I knew how hard you worked. I knew what you had done to achieve all of this. And it was funny. He didn't need to apologize to me, but it was neat because it was a journey for him too. And he came to understand and appreciate the fact that that it wasn't, and as a parent now, I fully get it. I mean, my she's only 5, but I can't have my expectations for her life be more important than hers. And so hopefully that someday when I grow up, I'll fully have that matured in my mind.
Someday.
Yeah, someday.
I love it. And I appreciate that your father realized what I'm not sure a lot of people do is that he had mistaken what he thought was not projecting his desires on you. He thought, "Oh, I'm protecting him from,
Yeah,
making a bad decision." And a buddy of mine, Jason Goldberg, he's once said about other people's judgments of your quit, he said they're either protecting or projecting, neither of which is your problem. And I love that
that's
he
true.
he
So true.
realized that he thought he was doing one, but he was actually doing the other. And I think a lot of people have that. And either way, it's not your problem. But I think people really get into that, oh, I'm protecting you. But you're right. They're protecting you based on their own expectations and their own
Yeah.
projections of what happiness should look like for you.
And I think even now more than anything, I think it's probably more projection than anything. In any decision we make. I mean, you've seen it. You've attained tremendous status in a variety of disciplines, and if people were to look at you and say, well, wait a minute, why aren't you doing something with A or B or whatever? And oftentimes it's people don't understand it. And more often than not, I think in some cases there's a bit of envy or, maybe even jealousy. It's like, because I used to hear that a lot. Oh man, if I had your skills or if I had your, I would never quit. And it's like, well, you don't understand the journey that I took to get where I got. You don't understand how hard I worked. And it doesn't matter if you do or don't, because it's my life is my life, your life is your life. And so I think getting past that makes it easier now too, because it's not, baseball wasn't my only quit, and when you start to move into something else or you want to transition into doing something differently, you're always going to have people that have questions about it, but I allow them to have that. I think it might have been Wayne Dyer who said, what other people think is is none of your business. And it's, it's kind of true, because we can't be encumbered by what other people think. We can use it if they're guiding us or asking questions or whatever, but our decision to choose to do something different, or to quit something, is our decision.
Yeah, and I do get those questions all the time. You're absolutely right. Like, why don't you use your law degree? And you made a perfect point, is that 0% of the people asking you those questions have been in your shoes. Even the ones that have been close to your shoes, other people who've been in the major leagues pitching, they haven't been in your exact shoes with your exact family, your upbringing, whatever situation you've been traded from this place to that place. Like, nobody has been in your shoes. So nobody but you knows what it's like and can decide what's best for you. And
Well said.
yeah,
So
thank you.
true.
Thank you. And I also think when people ask that question, it gives, for people like you and I who have thought well through our quits, it gives us an opportunity to maybe educate on a different way of thinking. Because if they're sitting there thinking, like, I can only imagine that the MLB is the greatest thing ever and that I would never ever want to quit, and then you bring up, but I had these other passions, these values, things that I thought were more important than baseball, it may open them to a whole nother, like, wow, you shouldn't just go for whatever job seems the hardest to get and therefore the most impressive. You should get and stay with whatever job or go for whatever job is the most in line with your values. And that may just open that person up to another level of thinking. If they're like, why aren't you a lawyer? And I say, well, you can do a lot of things with a law degree, but I realize that the practice of law involved way more fighting than I felt comfortable doing. And I could use it in many other ways, and I still do in election reform ways, but I don't want to be in a courtroom yelling all day long. Does that sound, fun to anybody? I mean, it looks fun on TV, but I'm not sure that it's actually that fun in person. That's
Yeah.
it's just kind of redirecting their thought process and showing what it looks like to live a life aligned with your values and your passion and your purpose, more than just what society tells you should be cool. Like, society makes being a lawyer look cool. Society makes being a major league pitcher look really cool, but that's just the on TV version. We don't see the behind the scenes. And those people making those questions to us have not seen the behind the scenes. So,
Totally. And the other thing that I came to realize was, yeah, I absolutely fulfilled a dream, but that's not mutually exclusive of having other dreams and pursuing those. And I, and it was like, we don't get just to choose that. It's like, okay, here's your path and you did a good job. Now, with athletics, of course, there's a time frame. But it used to kind of be, you go work for somewhere for 40 years, even if you don't like it, it's what you do. And then you retire just in time to have your body start failing on you and not be able to do all these other fun things. It's like, forget it. Physically, if I'm capable of continuing to play baseball, I'm physically and intellectually capable of doing other things. And that was the other thing a little bit too, is I wasn't exercising up here as much. And because for me, at least, the dedication to my craft and to perfecting what I did in baseball took all my time. And that was a lot of mental training, but that's different mental training than intellectually training myself. And so I missed a little bit of that, and wanted to do it. And now, this isn't to say that I couldn't have done multiple things while I was playing baseball. We had about a 4-month off season, but 4 months, because so much of it was training, and getting prepared for the season too. So it's not like April 1st when, they say play ball and then you shut it down in September, or ideally October if you're in the World Series. But it is just, at least for me, it was a challenge. And again, I knew for me to dedicate myself to fulfilling myself in other areas, I finally made peace with myself that I had achieved what I set out to do in baseball, and I didn't need to put conditions on whether or not I had achieved it all the way or not. I did, and that didn't come right away. But when I did get that, it freed me up into these other pursuits that I have taken advantage of since.
what made you almost want to go back a few years later?
I saw guys who were playing that, frankly, weren't as good as me, but they were playing, they were still playing. And my competitive urge kicked back in. I had a little bit of time to think about it. I'm like, well, you can still go do it. So why wouldn't you? Even though I'd already answered those questions for myself, it was a challenge too, because by then I had had a little bit of time to reflect. And I was physically capable still and in good shape and still very competitive. And I thought, you know what? Now I've got a little bit more perspective. I know I'd be going back because I want to compete again, and that was clarity that I lacked at the time when I was leaving, because I was still worrying about all these other things. And then it's like, oh, maybe I should go back and do this again. And I started training again, and my stuff, what you call stuff as a pitcher, was really good. Um, and it just kind of one day clicked, and it was more of a physical click because I hadn't been doing the same exact preparation that I had done before, and my shoulder got sore, and I was like, oh man, this is going to put me behind. And that soreness in my shoulder gave me some more time to reflect. That said, nope, nope, you're done. You want to be done, and you're ready to go. So, but it did take. It was 10 years before I set foot in a baseball stadium. After I retired, I couldn't do it until 10 years later.
What did you fear was going to happen? What did you fear
I
you'd
didn't.
feel?
I didn't so much. Well, I think you're right. I think it was a mixture of anger, fear. I mean, every negative emotion is really a mixture of anger and fear, I think. And for me, it was, I was also still feeling a little bit burned, because the game had been political, and by then they had established rules that prevented steroid abuse, or at least punished it. And so for me, it was just too raw. I was just too raw to want to go back, knowing that I had achieved. It was like after that, I had friends like, hey, you should come play beer league softball with us. And I thought I would rather hang myself from the rafters than go play. I didn't say this, but when you play at the highest level of something professionally, the idea for me of doing it casually, was not in the cards. And so I think I just needed the separation for myself, because even with the decision that I had made, there's always a little percentage of, did I make the right decision? And I just, it was just time. It was just raw. It was just raw for me. It seems funny to think something could be raw after 10 years, but it was.
No, I mean, time works its magic, but not always in the same amount of time. I wanted to come back
Yes.
to something that you said that I love, and I'm going to get it put on a shirt or something. Quitting for you was a soulful mandate. That may be my
Mhm.
favorite thing anybody has ever said, because people
Good.
ask questions like, how did you quit? Or, how do you get over this and that about quitting? And when a quit comes up for me, that is as important to me as apparently this one was to you, it feels exactly like that. It's like once I've decided that this isn't working for me, there isn't an option to stay. Like
Yeah.
I can try to stay and my body will freak out in 40 different ways. There'll be anxiety
Yep.
or insomnia or whatever. It's like, no, 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 no. You should quit. Stop postponing this for whatever of these other reasons you're telling yourself. Examine those reasons, realize they're not valid. They don't compare to the fact that this is out of line with your values. And that sounds like what you went through. You were like, this isn't so much that, yes, there were things going on in baseball that you didn't love being part of or being in that atmosphere, but you were called to do something else. And I think once that switch hits, right, it's really hard to go back.
Yeah. And I think, and I didn't realize this at the time. I do now, but we try to think our way through a lot of these things, like there's some sort of logical, linear way of making this kind of decision. And I think what was so frustrating for me at the time is my thinking wasn't clear, but my feeling was. And so for me now, I understand it as the difference between thinking in the head and feeling in the heart. And it's not just some new age way of saying that. I literally felt it in my heart. I felt it from my chest to everywhere else. It was telling me, this is time. I'm freeing you up. My soul was freeing me to make this decision rather than my brain trying to make logical sense of it, because it didn't make logical sense. I was physically capable. I was very competitive. I had a lot of good teammates. I had a good job, so to speak. Um, but it was very much what I recognize now, and I'm still not great at it, but I try to be driven by what I'm feeling more than what I'm thinking. In fact, invariably when I put myself into trouble, it's because I'm trying to think my way through it rather than feel through it. Life isn't solving a math problem, and which I was terrible at with math. But so it's always a good reminder for me, if I'm feeling something that strong, that's what I need to be listening to.
Yes, that's so crucial. I love that you brought up the example of feeling it in your chest. I think that's where a lot of people feel it. but they may not identify that that's what they're feeling. So if anybody out there listening, you just feel this kind of like heaviness in your chest, or like your chest is full. Is that
Yep.
kind of what it feels like for you, or when it did?
Yeah, full. And, based on whatever decision I made, I mean, I was strong. We got measured all the time for our physical capacity, and I had a strong heart. My heart, because I worked so hard, I had a strong heart. But your heart's like anything else. If you push it too much, and that's not just physically, if you push it too much when you're kind of counterbalancing this stuff, this is why people drop dead of heart attacks. They sit there and they keep going, and the stress compiles, and and it's an emotional reaction that ultimately causes a physical response. So I learned that was, I knew I couldn't do that for very much longer, because I was physically capable of pushing through a lot, but I was not soulfully capable of doing the opposite of what my soul was really trying to relieve me of.
Oh, I love that. That's so good. And you're right. So many of us are taught to ignore our feelings. And I see these memes every day, quitters never win, winners never quit. And my other least favorite one that I see multiple times a day come up on Instagram, it says, when you think about quitting, remember why you started. And that's again telling you, if you're feeling like quitting, think about why you started. Like try to
Yeah,
override those feelings. That's how I interpreted it. Obviously, in the most negative way possible to anybody who's
sure.
countering quitting, because to me, I feel like all that does is throw more pressure on people to stay in things and to use their brain to fight and overcome through logical thought, when your heart and your soul are telling you, get me out of here. That's not only unproductive, but it's actually really detrimental. Like you said, you become
Yeah.
weaker, and you're out of alignment, and your health can suffer. And so I appreciate you saying, like, it's more important to feel what your soul and your heart are telling you in this society where that is not, I mean, we're getting there. We're mentioning that more and more often, but there were
Yeah.
just, for so long, it was like, get that mental fortitude to just keep going regardless. Don't listen to your heart, and listen to your head, and make sure your head is saying the right good things. And if your head is saying negative things, just shut it down and keep
Yeah.
going.
Well, and your heart, your heart's not just going to tell you when it's time to quit something, too. It is going to tell you when it is time to push through those nagging suspicions and doubts. And it's not just a sports metaphor. I mean, it doesn't have to be just competitive in that way, but certainly, and especially too, growing up, as a kid, a boy, and then a young man, and then into adulthood, we do favor that sort of challenge. I won't break down into the locker room talk that we would, how we would encourage each other, but like the memes that we see now on social media, they, back in the day, they were T-shirts or something on the high school gym. Pain is just weakness leaving the body. Just remember, when you're ready to quit for the day, someone somewhere is working harder than you, and when you face them, they're going to beat you. Stuff like that. And so as a kid, I was like, hell no, I'm going to be that guy. And even when in college, or high school, disagreements with coaches or performances, the things that were negative compelled me to work harder. And I was a master at working harder, not smarter, for a long time. And it wasn't until I reversed that I started to see the success that I really felt was necessary. But there were points at any point where I would have been justified from an outside perspective to say, nah, I quit. But I was never justified in here until I was. And so, again, that feeling is very good. It can help you when you think, hey, this is maybe not what I want. If you're still saying maybe, then you don't know, and anytime I came up to the maybe, this feeling that I was feeling was still saying, see it through until you're ready. Um, and then, like I said, it was kind of a light switch, when it became that mandate for me.
Yeah, I like that, because I had written down from the beginning, there was a period where you almost quit before, and your heart
Mhm.
said, you've got more.
Yep.
And then when you came up on the second time, your heart was like, no, 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 we've got other things to do. And
Yes.
so you've seen
Yes.
both sides of it. It wasn't like, okay,
Mhm.
the first time I wanted to quit baseball, I quit. No, you saw when, like you said, your feelings tell you to keep going versus your feelings telling you this is no longer working for you. And the difference there also, in between those two, you had achieved your goal. And I think that's probably a lot
Yeah.
of what your heart is telling you is like, you've done your thing, Doug.
And that's an important distinction, because I had a lot of friends who, when they didn't quit, somebody quit for them. They were let go and they couldn't do it. And, to this day, that still hurts a lot of those guys. But there are some that it's like, nah, I just wasn't good enough, and they get it, but they did see it through. And it is important though to because you are going to have those points. I think that's what's scary, especially for any professional athletes considering this now. It's hard to know what the distinction is when your heart's telling you keep going versus when your heart's relieving you and saying that's enough. Do something different. That's scary for us. I mean, I think we'd all like it if there was just somebody sent us an email or something, said, hey, it's cool. This is from your heart. You can shut it down now. But it's not that easy, but it can be. It does take a lot less head and a lot more heart though. And, again, that's not talk that most baseball players want to hear either. Any male professional athlete, they don't want to hear that kind of weird talk.
Well, hopefully you can be the first to maybe any of them will ever hear this podcast. That's quite aspirational, but why not? Shoot for the stars, more
Sure.
right?
Sure. Well, hey, your star is on the rise. So pretty soon, it was funny when I was playing, what do they call them? Sports medicine was what they fell under, but they were basically head doctors for professional athletes. And I remember they would come in and they were basically just psychologists, but they were more trying to help you work through the mental blocks. Like if guys would all of a sudden, they can't throw the ball to first base, or, when I played, there was a famous guy, Rick Ankiel, just an absolute phenom, who one day got what we call the yips, and he could not throw a strike anymore. I mean, this was a guy who was a future Hall of Famer, and he couldn't throw the ball straight. He was throwing it over the catcher. He's throwing it to the left. I mean, and eventually he had to stop, came back as an outfielder, and played for a couple of years after having had to leave the game because he physically couldn't do it anymore. And so that's what the head doctors in baseball kind of go for, is like, what is your mental hangup that you can't do this? But there's nobody out there doing what you're doing. So maybe you're about to blaze that trail.
That would be phenomenal. I appreciate that, the confidence, Doug. This was as delightful as I could have ever expected, and well worth the year I waited for it, Doug.
Well, thank you again for your patience, and it's always a pleasure to chat with you. You have such a buoyant understanding of this subject matter, but your personality too is just so engaging. So it's always a pleasure chatting with you.
I'm just going to have you on more episodes to say nice things. Really, that's you have made my day, Doug. Thank you so much. I usually say, like, where can people find you? But I think you're in a project now that you want people to find.
A couple different things. Yeah, probably one that's most interesting is it's not totally dissimilar from electoral reform. I still, after I had gotten out of baseball, one of the things that itch that I knew I needed to scratch was taking care of our republic, is how I would categorize it. And we have so many things, especially now, that we all see as wrong, but we have so many opportunities for what's right. And we need to shift our gaze from all of the things that we think are wrong, drop some of our guard on on political, ideological, or partisan issues, and focus on things that are. One of the unifying things that we need to get back to focusing on is freedom of expression and exchange of ideas. So one project I'm working on right now is the creation of a new platform for social media. And it's not just for politics. In fact, it's probably healthier if it's not a lot of politics. It's for everything. So think of anything that you like about social media, sharing your pictures with grandma and grandpa, family stuff, friends, communities, and also political discourse is welcome. So we're really working in this era of often troublesome practices by the social media giants. We're working on a very open platform that everybody can come on and feel free to speak their mind. And it's not going to be one of those wide open where you can post violence or other unsavory things, but it's an opportunity to go on and say, hey, I can go on there and express my opinion. I'm not going to be censored. So so that's called All Social. So yeah, it's kind of fun. That's a fun project I'm doing right now.
Very cool. Well, thank you again for sharing your story with me, Doug. And for everybody else out there, until next time, happy quitting.